Hello, you lovely painters. Another week of painting. We are going to do a painting of the Aurora from a lovely photo that I have permission to use. And we were so lucky this summer. We had electrical storms, and many of us in Canada, and I know the UK and different countries, were able to see the Aurora, or what we call the Northern Lights too, for the first time. And people got amazing photos. I saw so many beautiful ones. So today we're going to pick one of those photos that has our theme, which is a lovely sky and a silhouette, and it's local. I think it's in Prince George that it was taken, so it's fairly, not really local, but you know, British Columbia, and we're going to paint. So you're going to need some lovely transparent colours like Phthalo Green, Prussian Blue, Phthalo Blue, nice transparent colours to make this beautiful sky. So come along with me, get your paints ready, a piece of paper, and let's paint. So we are doing the Aurora today, and it is a photo by Rob Romeyn. I wrote to him and asked his permission, of course, and he said it'd make a beautiful watercolour. What I'm starting to do now is actually send the people one of my demos that I do as a thank you for them, because I feel that they deserve something for their beautiful photos. So we're going to try and emulate the lovely colours here. Phthalo Green or Windsor Green or what's the other? Viridian Green are all good for this beautiful, beautiful green colour that you get in the Northern Lights that most of us were privileged to see this summer. And also when I looked out on the day that we had them the best, the back of my sky was all pink. It was that real quinacridone pink. So we're going to do a second layer to get the pink, because obviously if we have the green coming up against the pink here, we're going to make a really muddy grey colour. So we're going to do just like last week when we did the surfer. We're going to leave a space for the blue, which we'll put on in the second layer. And we're not going to do any of the pink in the first layer. We're going to do the sort of the greens and the blues in the first layer, dry it, and then put on the pinks, the purples, and the other colours and the blue. So that way we shouldn't get any bleeding through of colours. It doesn't matter if we get a bit of green here, because there's lots of green in the background. So I think I'm going to cover my painting with some paper towel while I mix some colour. We want to have some colours ready. I'm going to use my ceramic palette to get some colours in. The first one we want is a nice bright yellow. So whatever your bright yellow is, my favourite is the Azo Yellow. So I'm going to get some of that first and have a good puddle of that. The thing that you want to remember is not to have anything too thick, because the actual paper, the white from the paper reflecting through the paint, is going to make it glow. That's what makes that glow in the paint, rather than thick paint. So I've got my yellow there. Now I'm going to do another one here where I'm going to mix yellow with my Phthalo Green, or you can use Viridian Green or Windsor Green, all very similar. My Phthalo Green is Phthalo Green Yellow shade. I do have a Phthalo Green Blue shade. I don't use it as much. I just find this one makes more beautiful colours. So I'm mixing it with the yellow because I want kind of a yellowy green. I might put a little bit more yellow in there because the phthalo is very, very strong. I've got that, look at that beautiful, beautiful spring green. I'm going to just put it on the side here, just to kind of test it against my photo. That looks okay. Now I'm going to put pure Phthalo Green in this one. It's a very transparent colour, so it's really going to allow us to see the white paper reflecting through. I just want to see what other colours I need for my first. And we need Prussian Blue. I want to get some Prussian Blue. Prussian is a lovely, strong, transparent, cool blue. That's a great one to put in a sky like this. All of these are transparent colours, so they'll keep that transparency that makes the paper glow through. And I'm going to put a little bit of cobalt in one of these little wells. So I have some cobalt blue. That's for our softer blues. We'll do some in the first layer, some in the second layer. And then that's all we're going to need for the first layer. So I'm making these colours fairly wet, but what's called sort of creamy, sort of not too wet, because we're going to wet the whole paper, and if we have our colours too wet and too diluted, they just get washed out, and they don't make a nice vibrant colour. We don't want them too thick, otherwise your paper can't glow through. So they need to like run around in, you know, in your palette, but they should also have quite a bit of pigment in, so they're creamy. I've got all those ready. Reminded people, just like last week when we left the white space for the blue, we're going to leave this white space for the cobalt blue in the second layer. So we need to remember that. We need to remember above these trees needs to be white with this very light cobalt blue. And if you look at this one is stark white there. We probably don't need it to be that stark, but we definitely want some white space in here. So plan that in your head so that you don't have, you know, yellow coming all the way down here. It doesn't matter if you do, it'll still look lovely, but it's kind of nice to try and have that open part right there. And make sure I get my whole paper, everything, all the paper, nice and wet and receptive to this color. Now you're going to be using a lot of the skills you learned last week doing the Sunset Surfer, because they are very similar skills. We're just using different colors, that's all. And a different format, of course, because this is in portrait mode and last week was landscape. Get rid of a little bit of the excess water around the side because I don't want a big run back into my painting. It's all nicely wet. And I'm going to remember that big white patch that I need to leave for the blue. Don't want to forget that. I'm going to stick with my 3/4 inch flat for a moment to see how I do. Sometimes I still prefer my round brushes, but we'll see. And I'm going to start with my yellow, my bright yellow, above where the white is going to go with the blue. So I want to make sure that I leave that space. And then I'm going to go straight in with my yellow and green mix. I'm just going to grab my reference photo because I want to make sure I'm looking at the reference photo. And my brush is a little wet, so I'm going to dry it off a little bit because I don't want too much wet going into the paper. Just dried it on a towel. And grab a bit more of that. I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow and transition them. Just go over the transition there so that I can sort of soften it together. Now I'm going into the Phthalo Green. It's going to be fairly pale on this first layer. Not too pale, but again, I'm drying off my brush a little bit and just softening the transitions. Then the Cobalt Blue, and then the Prussian Blue. Now we haven't gone dark yet. We're going to go dark in the second layer. I do want a little bit more Phthalo Green. It's still wet. I'm going to put a little bit more on there. Wash and dry my brush and get a little bit more yellow. Now what I find when I'm using a flat brush like this is I get a linear look that I don't want. And that's the one reason I've never really gravitated towards a flat brush. I'm seeing a really flat line here that I don't like. So for the bottom of the page, I'm going to switch to my big number 10 round. I just get on better with it. And I might want to make sure again I've got a bit of space for the blue. And I'm not going to put the yellow underneath. There's not much yellow, but I'm going to put the yellowy green. Get the yellowy green. And I'm going to leave the space for the blue. I'm going to go right across. And then the Phthalo Green. And then the Prussian Blue. You see, when I'm using a round brush, I don't get such a linear look, which is what I prefer. I think the square brush is good for a lot of things, but I'm just probably not very competent at using it, that's all. Now we are going to go darker with our second layer, no problem with that. And I would like to add a little bit of yellow light in here. Let's just raise my camera up a little bit. So it's still wet. I'm going to take some quite strong yellow on a quite dry brush, not too wet. And I'm going to boldly go where no man's gone before. Now I'm going to boldly streak in a bit of yellow on top of that. Just get a bit of a glow going on in that reflection. Because it's wet, I can do that, and the yellow will push into the green and just brighten it up in some spots. And see, I think with my round number 10, this has a much softer look than I managed to get with that flat brush up here. I've got a streak there I would never ever have if I was using a round brush. So good to know. I've been trying and experimenting with it. So I want that to soak in while you do that too. I want it to soak in and blend a little bit, and then I will go to the hairdryer and dry that up. Now, because we're going to re-wet everything, you do want to make sure that this is bone dry. I spent a lot of time with the hairdryer, moving it around a lot to make sure this is absolutely dry before I go to the next layer. I also want to decontaminate my yellow, which has a little green in it here. Let's clean that up. There are very few times that I use a lot of phthalo green in a painting. It's so strong. This is one of those times that it's absolutely the perfect color for this painting. And also, you know, if you're mixing spring greens, it's a lovely, lovely color, and darks. When we're mixing these darks, it's invaluable as a lovely transparent color for dark. So it's a very useful color, just not one that has a lot of use in landscapes probably. Oh, I really don't like this line I have here, so I'm going to try and fix that in my second layer by adding a little bit more yellow there and the pink, and kind of trying to just disguise that a little bit. We want to have Quinacridone Rose. Now let's get some of that ready. A little bit of water, oh, dirty brush, clean it up a little bit. Oh, some nice rose. I think Quinacridone Rose is one of my favorite colors. It is so beautiful, and you can mix it with almost anything to make a beautiful color. Stunning color. I'm going to put a little bit of that there. And then we're going to do Phthalo Blue and Quinacridone Rose to make a lovely lilac. Or you can do the Prussian Blue with Quinacridone Rose. Either one's fine. Phthalo's just a little bit lighter than the Prussian, so it makes a lighter violet. I want to make sure it's a good amount of colour. We've got quite a bit of paper to cover. We don't want to stint on colour. Add a little bit more rose to that, make it a little bit more rosy. Now, I'm also going to, I've got my Prussian Blue here. I'm going to mix my Quinacridone Magenta with that to make a really deep colour. But if you don't have Quinacridone Magenta, you can mix Quinacridone Rose with the Prussian Blue to get a really dark. And we're going to get I'm going to just paint on the side here. So we're getting a darker one there. And then we want the slightly pinker one here. So I've got a little bit more pink in the one underneath it. And then right at our transition area, I want to have a little bit of pink in the transition area. So I want those. Oh, and I still have some cobalt here. I'm going to use a little bit of cobalt across here. So if you don't have enough cobalt, you want a little bit for this area in the middle there. And we also want just Prussian Blue by itself. We need a lot of colors for this, I know, I'm sorry. I can go back if you miss one, don't worry, just ask me, I'll go back. So just some Prussian Blue. That's why I got my ceramic palette out, so I had lots of space. And I want some Payne's Grey for the really dark part of the sky. Now we're going to use all these colors to make black, so we can just take them and mix them all together to make black when we do the silhouette. So don't worry about it. You will need them. I'm going to put some Payne's Grey in here. Sometimes when you watch people do this on YouTube, they keep putting these colors in wet, more wet color, and honestly that's an awful way to do it. You just get such a big wet mess and everything tends to make grey. The way to do it is this way, layers, and then you can really control your paints and they don't mix and make grey and mud and lift your paper because you're using so much water. What I find is if people do a lot of wet and then more wet and then more wet and then more paint, their paper just starts to break down and lift and pill, and they end up with a really soggy mess. So that's not good. Right, let's move my protective paper towel. So do not go on to this stage, second stage, until this is perfectly dry and ready to be wet again without lifting any paint. So I'm going to get my big brush. And when you wet for the second time, you need to be very gentle, and that's why, see, one of these colors is lifting. So I just need to be very gentle. Some colors stain well and some don't. So whatever that was that's lifting is not staining well. Might be that I put the cobalt there. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Anyway, let's chip it and see how we're doing. Right, I haven't got enough wet in the middle here. Tip it and see, I still need a little bit here. So interesting. I think the Prussian, yeah, the Prussian is lifting a little bit. It's not staining well. That's okay. I think it's going to be fine. Get my Kleenex and make sure I don't have a wet edge. Make sure it's all wet. I think it is. Now I'm going to find a little brush, number 4 will do me, because in here where this blue is, I want quite a bit of control, and I'm going to start with that. That's the Cobalt Blue, just a very gentle blue. And I want to put in I'm going to go right over the trees. Don't stop where the silhouette is, because you'll have an odd thing happening there. So I want to put in the blue clouds across here. And I think I might have left a little bit too much white. I was being a bit too cautious. Doesn't matter. I'm going to put in those little clouds. Some are fluffy. Some are just straight. Using just the point of my brush to get some of those in. I can actually see some behind the trees here. And there's a little bit of white just above these trees here. There's a little bit of white sky showing. I'm going to get the tiniest bit of lilac on the tip of my brush, the more pinky lilac. And I'm going to add, I got a minimal amount, add a little bit of lilac in here to those clouds. And wash my brush, because I want to do a little bit of the blue down in the reflection here, just down here. And again, I'm going to take it right across, because it looks strange if it stops just short of the silhouettes that you're going to put on later. Now, I'm debating whether to try a little bit of yellowy green with my round brush to try and get rid of that line that I don't like across there. So I'm just flicking very gently. That's where I find a round brush is more helpful to me. Flicking very gently across there with my yellowy green. To try and disguise that line I had that I don't like. A little bit of my Phthalo Green. Just adding a little bit more colour and deepening some of that. I'm going to grab just a little bit of Phthalo Green here too. I'm going to add a little bit more deep colour in here. And in here. Going for a bit more. Remember, a lot of this is going to be black. A lot of this is going to be very dark, so it helps form your dark layer if you put a little bit more colour in at this stage. Well, then I'm going to get a really clean brush now, because I want to take a little bit of the rose colour and start that up here. Not too close to the green that I just put on. We're trying to get a graduation of all these colours. The one that's rose and Phthalo Blue, I'm putting that on. Then now I'm switching to the magenta and Prussian, putting that on. And I'm going to let that soak in for a little bit. I'm coming back to it in a moment. I'm just going to let it soak in. And I'm going to come down the page, and I'm going to take the Prussian Blue. It's still wet down at the bottom of the page here. And I'm going to stroke in some of that Prussian Blue down here. I don't want to do too much because I want to have, I've got a hair right there, take it out when it's dry. I want to have some green showing through these reflections that come down, so I want to have some green still there, but I do want to darken this edge a little bit, and there's going to be some shadows coming out here. And that's given these colours a little bit of time to blend in, so that I can take the Payne's grey that I mixed, it's just Payne's grey on its own, and I'm going to take that across the top of the sky. Going to grab a little bit of the pinky violet and make sure I have a bit of a transition there. And then I want to leave it, because if I start to do what I said a lot of people on YouTube do, which is just they keep going with the paint, the water, the color, it just becomes a soaked mess that you can't work with. And I can see, you can literally see as the paper starts to kind of pill up a little bit with the moisture, and that's when you have to leave it. And I want to make sure there's no run back. There's a little bit of run back happening just here. I'm going to just suck that up a little bit. Now, whenever you're doing a wet in wet like this, you don't want to go to the hairdryer too soon, or you will spoil the effect. So you want to give it a chance to I'm just going to grab that hair out of there. Give it a chance to blend and work its magic. Don't try and blend it with your paintbrush. And what I've got happening here, which I actually quite like, which isn't in the photo, but I've got this lilac bleeding down into the green. And I did see that effect from the Aurora when I looked at it. It's a great effect and sometimes very difficult to achieve, and it's doing it on its own. So I'm just going to leave it to do that. And I'm quite happy that it's doing that without my help. And that's why I don't want to go to the hairdryer yet. I want it to finish doing its thing and move around with the water. I do not like right here when my colour has bled down to the tape, but that's what a mat's for. If you want to actually frame your painting, you're going to frame your painting so that the mat comes over the side of it, and you can cut off any little nasty areas like that you don't like. Yeah, that's nice and dry. And it lightens quite a lot once it dries. I mean, I put quite dark paint on at the top here, maybe not even dark enough, and it has lightened quite a bit. So if I really felt I needed it, I could always put a darker layer at the top. And I do notice that in my notes, on my second layer, I only wet the sky and I worked on this dry. It doesn't matter. I wet the whole thing for the second time. And sometimes I only do it that way so that we have more working time. You don't have to go to the hairdryer so often, that's all. So it doesn't matter if you do them separately for the second wash. And I do think that if I could put a bit more colour on, but I'm finding that the Prussian Blue lifts quite a bit when I wet it, so I maybe don't want to disturb it. This is how it is, and that's as good as it gets. And what's really going to make it glow is, of course, having all of the dark colours to make the light colour show up. So that's where we're going to focus our attention next. And I'm going to put that on dry and get my wet brush. Wet that in and just see, and put a little bit of lilac-y cloud in without wetting the sky. Because I kind of like the lilac against those colours. Using a wet brush to just put a little bit of lilac coming in. So just putting it on dry paper, just pulling it in with a wet brush. And a little bit of pink. Grabbing a little bit of Quinacridone Rose now. I'm literally just experimenting and playing. Wet brush. I've got my number 4 brush. And just easing those little clouds in. Because I think I needed a little bit more colour. A little bit more cohesiveness between the top of the sky and the bottom, which I did have in the first one. You have to use a wet brush carefully to just get those blended in a little bit. Just a little extra. I don't think I need to dry those because I'm going to work down here and they should be dry by the time I come up to do the silhouette further up. So I think they'll be okay. Little thing there just to protect my painting. We are going to use all of this dark paint in here to build a nice dark color. So we definitely want the Prussian Blue. We want some Phthalo Green. I'll add it to that. Some Quinacridone Magenta and some Payne's Grey should make you a really nice dark that's transparent. If it's still not dark enough, you could add a bit of sepia, but I'm pretty sure we should get it dark enough with these colors. So I'm going to add a little bit more Prussian to that. And then all of this Payne's Grey can go in there. All of this color can go in there. Let's use it up. Not dark enough yet, but we're getting some good color in there. Get it into that well. Get over there. Right, I've got some of that color in there. I still haven't got anywhere close to enough. So I'm going back in with a bit more Prussian. And some Payne's Grey. Payne's Grey is nice and dark, but it's not dark enough on its own. It's still a fairly light, transparent grey. And then I want some magenta. You can use Quinacridone Rose if you don't have magenta. And I'm also going to put some Phthalo Green in there, or your Viridian Green if that's what you have. Lots of paint and not very much water. It should be nice and creamy, like cream, but wet. Still has to be wet, still has to be movable. A bit more Payne's Grey. Then I want to test it on some paper. Grab a piece of paper and see what we got. It's fairly dark, but it's very green. We need a bit more magenta and blue in that. It's too green at the moment. It's looking too green, and of course the magenta is the complement of the green. And a little bit more of the Prussian Blue. And then let's have another go with that dark colour. Oh, way better. Yeah, it's definitely not so green. Let me just, I will dilute that out, because if you dilute it out, you can kind of see the component parts of the colour. A lot of nice grey in there. So I think what I've got here is going to be okay for now. Get us started anyway. And I'm going to put that somewhere I can reach it. Put it right beside me. Sorry about the noise. And I'm going to need some smaller brushes, because first of all we have to do these little tiny trees in the middle here, and they are going to require probably a number 4 brush, nothing too big. And we're going to use the point of the brush to get the tops of the trees. So I'm going to roll my number 4 brush, I'm going to roll it in that lovely creamy thick but liquid paint, and start just in the middle. We're going to start in the middle. I know it's an odd place to start, but we're sort of starting with the far away trees. Let's zoom in now. We don't need to see the whole piece of paper. Right, using the very tip of my number 4 brush, I'm going to start with these little trees in the distance. And I just me, probably, I don't know if it's just me, I like to start with the tips of the trees. Now, even though I'm going to come along with more colour into these trees, I want to make sure that I actually have tree shapes on each side. Otherwise I could have a straight line here that will show through when I come in with the rest of the colour. So always think about that. Think about where you stop your paint lines, that you're not going to have an obvious straight line when you come in with your next colour. Also, it's a mistake to do, like, I'm going to show you what you shouldn't do first. You shouldn't go all the way along this. I'm doing it wrong now. Please be aware this is wrong. You shouldn't go all the way along this top here without coming down into the rest of the paint. Otherwise, again, you will have a line across the top there that starts to dry before you get the rest of the paint in, and then you're going to get a line where the two paints meet, where the dry paint meets the wet paint, and it will look odd. So you have to sort of work on a section at a time, and you can't stop. Well, you can, I mean, there's nothing to stop you from stopping, but if you want to have a lovely even wash, you can't stop for anything. You can't go make a cup of tea, answer the door, answer the phone. You at least have to get to a place across here where you can take a breather and it won't leave too odd a shape. See, I'm coming into trees that are closer here, so I can take a breather there. And when I come back to do this, it will be a shape that's going to fit. And also across here a little bit too. Now, where's I need to just get this, because this is very undefined, which is quite good actually for watercolour, because if it's too defined, you make it all too obvious. But I think under here are actually sort of reflections of what we've just painted. I don't know for sure, but I think they are. But what I'm painting is just the shapes that I see. There's a little bit of an opening between those two. I'm just painting the shapes that I can see on the photograph. I don't quite know what they are, whether they're reflections or land. But this is where the dark sort of comes. And the thing to do is to leave some openings for the viewer's eye to have a space in there, something to look into. And it doesn't matter that mine has got sort of a misty look here and then a darker look here. That's just when my paint is different wetnesses. It doesn't matter. It kind of gives it that kind of a misty lake look. I don't mind that at all. And I want to make sure, yeah, that's dry for over there. So I'm going to work my way over to this side now from the center where the trees, you really can't see much detail in the photo, so that's good. I'm going to go over to these trees here. Picking up, you've got to pick up paint every few seconds. I want my little teeny weeny brush. My number 4 is not cutting it for the tops of these trees. I need to have my teeny brush for that. Go on to my new 0. Just putting in a little bit of detail at the tops of those trees with the little 0 brush. The 4 was too clunky. And again, don't leave too many edges. And again, I'm going to use my little brush in a moment. I'm just starting with my number 4. Grabbing my 0 and putting a few little tiny bits at the tops of the trees, little delicate parts. If you've ever looked up at the really tall trees, what happens is they're so far away from you. Let me grab this. The tops of the trees are so far away that you don't see the trunk often. What you see is, you can see it further down, but what you kind of see is a gap between the parts of the top of the tree and then these bits. So when I'm painting them, I quite often like to leave just a small gap at the top rather than connect them or put in a trunk, because that is what it looks like when you look up at a very tall tree and the top is a long way from your vision. I can't stop for too long because I will get a big line there. So again, with this one here, just going to put a few, with my little brush, a few little gaps at the top of that tree. I need to grab my photo. So what I've got to do here is I've got to fill this in quickly before we get any dry lines. Get that in. And this tree that's here, they're a little bit bigger. They're coming sort of towards the viewer. You can see a bit more of the top of this tree. I'm putting a little bit thicker top to it. Connecting the bottoms, and at this point I need to make sure I connect them because it could be starting to dry up. And I've got my little brush again, put some wiggly tree shapes in here. Make sure I get these shapes down here coming across before we dry up down here too. There's a piece of land comes out here. My small brush. Anytime you have some little lines, good idea to have a small brush in your hand to switch to it. And I still have a bit of a tree out here to do, so small brushing, and I'm a bit worried I'm going to smudge something with my hand at the moment, so I'm trying to be very careful on the tree here. And this is where I have my photograph beside me because I want to try and make it look like a tree and not just a strange shape. I actually do want it, because mine's slightly wider than the photograph. I am going to put another one there that's not in the photograph. And then I'm going to take a deep breath because that's quite a lot to accomplish in one fell swoop. There's a little island here. Well, a little piece of mud probably. Put that in there, and there's some little ripple sort of things. And as I come towards the viewer, I probably don't want to go quite as dark. I'm just going to shape that a little bit more there. Photos darken things and make them really solid, but in real life when you look at things you see a little bit more definition and a little bit more light. I want a bit of a tree I want to just connect there. I'm working on little things at the moment. There's a little tiny, another little piece of muddy grass sticking out here. I'm going to put that in. And of course there's lots over here too, but I'll do that when I've done all of the left side. Move up a little bit. So I've put this little island, muddy island in here, put this little one in here, and now I have quite a bit of just dark reflection from the trees here. I got ripples here, and there's actually some grass coming up here, so there's quite a bit to play with on that side. And I'm probably going to switch to a bigger brush now. Now I have my number 4 brush so that I could control the tree shapes over here, but I'm going to switch to my number 8 brush because I want to get these shapes on in bolder strokes. And I want to leave, I had it a little bit more transparent here, and I wanted to leave a bit more light over this side and a bit more light over this side, so it's not quite so closed off dark. So as I'm working down, I'm going to try and remember to do that. And after I've done that, I put some like ripples in, I put some grass in, that kind of just breaks up that area. Same with over here. But those are all final details that I can work on. I'm going to make sure I got enough colour. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a second well. I'm going to put some Phthalo Green in here. I'm going to take some of this colour over here so that I have a slightly lighter greener mix in there that I can switch to when I get down to the edge here. And then I'm going to continue on from where I stopped. And I'm quiet because I'm thinking. It's really important to think as you paint, because otherwise you tend to put stuff where you didn't want it, or it wasn't supposed to go. So I'm thinking about these little islands that are, or muddy banks or whatever they are, coming out of here. Making sure that I make the right shapes with them. And I'm just going to switch to that slightly lighter green that I mixed up, lighter mix that I mixed up, with a bit of green and a bit of that dark and a bit of water. So I'm sort of going to hopefully a slightly lighter colour. Definitely in the middle here it's quite a bit lighter. So I'll get even more water. So what I did was I grabbed a bit more water into this lighter colour that I mixed up. And over the centre here, just kind of here. See, my mix is a bit more watery. I'm going to take that over here so it's just sort of shadowed. Still fairly dark, but shadowed in here. Not as dark as the silhouettes and the shadow that's on the side. Still have that more watery mix. I think I'm going to add a little bit of Prussian Blue in with it. Blue it up a little bit. And have a little bit more blue here, especially as I come in for the ripples. Need a bit more water. Now I put a bit more blue, it's a bit stronger, so I'm going to add a little bit more water. See how it's lightening up as you come towards the viewer. It's not so dense. And where this comes around here, this is now where I've got to work on the ripples. So I've still got my number 8 brush in my hand. I'm using the point only and pulling those ripples back to the side here. and then it's quite dark coming towards the viewer here. So I'm getting some of the thicker, darker paint. I still have the lighter paint on my brush, but I grabbed a bit of the thicker, darker paint. For the foreground here. Make sure you can see what I'm doing. All right, let's add a little bit more. I'm going to add a little bit more Phthalo Green back into that watery mix, the watery mix that I made. Still got my number 8 brush. And I want to get some shadow down here. Now what I want to have is some nice light green just showing through the trees coming down. So I don't want to have it too dark over this side. So I'm washing my brush. My brush is wet, not too wet. I'm dabbing a bit of it off on my sponge. And I'm going to use that wet brush to just soften all of the edge of that shadow that I just put on, so that it's going to be lighter. Now I'm using a dry brush now to skip it over the paper so that that could look like ripples on this pond or whatever it is. I do want it a little bit darker at the edge, so I'm going to take some of the dark mix, and while this is wet, I'm just going to drop that into that wet area. There maybe. And just let that mix wet in wet with what I've got, so I have a nice dark edge to the painting. Sometimes it really glistens and you can barely see what I've done, but I'm just tipping it away from the light a little bit. So I put some of the darkest mix that I made up, the one here that had all of the grey and the magenta and everything in it. And because I tipped it, it went up a little fast. So I'm just going to use my damp brush again to just agitate it in so that it's got a nice soft edge to it. And I have quite a change of color here from that dark paint to the greeny paint to the bluey paint, and I really like that effect. And everything is really different to my first one, and that's all right. I have to start working on the trees over on the right. So I want to find my little 0 brush again, have my number 4 handy, and keep my number 8 in my left hand, because they're all going to be useful. I'm going to start, there's a little tiny tree poking up here. I'm going to start with that with my little 0 brush, because it's just tiny, and I'm going to bring that up here first. Kind of behind all these other trees. And what has actually happened to my dark paint is dipping a wet brush into it now and again has diluted it a little bit. So there was actually a oops, I'll get my hand in that. There was actually a space between this and the background which I have forgotten to leave. I'm not going to worry about that. Nobody knows about that. And if you notice on the edge of that tree that I just did, I've left a negative tree shape because I'm going to stop and mix up a bit more dark paint. It's watered down a little bit, and you can see I've used quite a lot of it, so I need to have a little bit more to finish this side. So I'm just going to stop and mix up a little bit more dark, ready to do the rest of that other side. And Payne's grey. I'm just going to test it out. Yeah, looks good to me. That looks fine. To my number 8 brush to mix, so I'm going to keep it, it's full of paint. I'm just going to keep it in my left hand and go back to my 0 for a moment because I want to get this treetop nice and fine. I'm not going to do the whole thing with my 0. I'm going to get my number 8 brush and go in with that so that I can fill in and not get too many lines. I'm going to add a few more little lines now. Switching back again to my 0. Some little tiny trees in here. Get those in before I switch back to my number 8. And there's a bit of land that comes out here, mud bank probably. And switch back again. I've got to get my little brush. The thing is, if I stopped and did just all the treetops with my little brush, they would dry before I managed to get in and connect them to this great big dark silhouette. So I have to do them one at a time. It also gives me time to think about the placement of them. I'm coming over a little ways. I don't want to come over too far because as I'm doing the treetops, I would probably smudge them with my wrist. So I have to keep them out the way of my mucky hands. Don't make them all the same height. Try and vary your brush strokes. It's tempting to just get into a rhythm and do the same height, same brush stroke, same style. Little tiny trees here. Now I need to start connecting a little bit down here. There are two in the photo, 2 trees that are roughly the same height. I'm just going to make one a little bit taller than the other. And there's a tall one on the side. Get my bigger brush and connect these before they dry. I think that's probably the hardest part of this is getting it all in and connected before parts of it get too dry. And then we're going to do the same as I did on the other side, where I switched to a slightly lighter, more diluted color to go down into some of the other areas, especially like this little muddy island here. Getting my diluted mix now. I've still got my big number 8 brush because I don't want to fiddle with these strokes, otherwise it's going to become very disconnected. To connect these up. And what I want to do before it's too dry, I'm getting my little very, very thin liner brush, and on this muddy bank, whatever it is, there's lots of reeds. I'm going to, a few here too, I'm flipping those up before that paint dries. A few here. I'm going to put in a little bit more colour in those ripples while I have that thin brush. And then I have to think about how these reflections come down into the water. And I think what I did was wet the paper. A very dangerous thing to do, though. I'm having second thoughts. I'm thinking about it. A little bit more dark in here. Well, I'm not entirely sure. I know I wet the paper, but I'm not entirely sure whether it's going to be a good idea or not. Because I want to get the definition of the dark coming into the light here, but if I don't wet the paper, it's going to be too defined. It's going to be way too defined. I hate to give you something to do that's going to be dangerous, but I'm going to be very careful wetting this paper, so not very wet. I don't want it running back, but I don't want those reflections to be too strong. Probably not even wet enough. I'll take a wet brush and manipulate them a little bit. It's too wet right now. I'm going to wait for it to dry just a little bit. That's what I said, it's really dangerous, but I'm not going to get that soft reflection if I don't. I'm going to come up against the wet here and just let it soak in a little bit before I bring the reflection down. Because otherwise it's just going to be too hard edged. I'm controlling the wet a little bit with my brush and just waiting, patiently waiting for it to be a little less wet to put the rest of that reflection in. And with my wet brush, I'm making these shadows softer across here in places. And a little bit more dark on the edge. And anything I do like that's got to be softened up with a wet brush. And the more I put some of those soft wet edges in, the more that this is going to look more natural, where I have this wet reflection coming down. Still very wet, just want to ease that down a little bit. So I need a little bit more Payne's grey. Just got Payne's grey. I'm going to add a little bit of the green to it, so it's a little bit thicker, and bring those reflections down. So what you're actually watching is me struggling and going through a thought process as I paint. Like, how can I achieve what I want? What can I do here to get what I want, which is a soft reflection. I have to connect it to what I was doing here with a bit more paint, which I mixed some Payne's grey with some Phthalo Green. I'll put a little bit of Prussian in now, and it's not very wet. This paint I just mixed doesn't move about the palette like my other paint. It's a bit thicker. That means it's going to go onto the wet paper without running too far. And by doing that, I'm trying to control what happens a little bit. And then I'm going to break it up with some ripples here. I can't, because it's wet, I can't put really wet paint on. I have to go drier than I had, so I also want to have a bit more dark at the corner here. So again, it's that paint that's not as wet as the other paint. And I'm bringing it round in. I know it's really difficult to see because it's wet and the light's shining on it, isn't it? That's the one problem with lovely wet paint. It's very shiny. Oh, I'm bringing those ripples round so it all kind of connects and doesn't look like it's not, you know, not supposed to be there. I do notice that I'm holding it so I notice that the reflections from those trees connect right to this dark in the photo, so I want to bring them down a little bit more and get the dark across here. And I'm sorry, it's really shiny where the wet paint is. But let me use the hairdryer and take some of that shine off so it's easier to see the actual paint. Now you can't see too well on the printed photo, but on the photo on the computer I could see quite a lot of reeds right here, and it's nice to have something like that in the foreground. So again, I'm going to use my script liner, my very thin script liner, and I'm going to use some of the dark paint. Any of the dark paint will do, and I want to put some of those reeds in the foreground just by flicking. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to add a little bit of sepia to the dark color to just brown it up a little bit for these, to just change the color up a bit. I'm using the Payne's grey and some sepia. So it's slightly different to what I've got going on behind it. And the sepia is a little bit more opaque, but doesn't matter because these are final foreground details. So I also have a thicker script liner. This thicker one is a number 2. I'm going to use that one as well. It gives a thicker line, and I'll get some like thicker reeds in the foreground with that, and I think I like that a little bit better. I can use this nice thin one, you know, for these ones back here, but this thicker one is rather nice for these ones. And also the script liner is also really nice for doing things like the ripples. It has a lovely thin point that you can pull along to do things like that. I'll put a few of those reeds on there. And you can see that the sepia makes it just slightly more opaque, which means you can actually see it over those dark colours. And there are also let's put some like reflections coming down like that across. Use a wet brush to make them less obvious. I'm putting just a little bit more detail in. And then there's a couple of more finishing touches that we can do if you want. They're not essential, but they are kind of fun. I'm just going to get my small brush, and some things, those little extras, like a few extra little ripples on the water, can give it a really nice finishing touch. I noticed that these shadows on the water they vary in depth. Sometimes they're quite dark and sometimes they're a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to add a little bit of, and because these trees are reflections, sometimes it's nice to go right over the top of them with some ripples so that you know that they're just reflecting in the water. And this, I've noticed that this Phthalo Green that I'm using lifts quite easily, and I'm wondering if I could even lift a few ripples if I wanted. It's going to take my very tiny lifting brush. This is another way to show reflections, is to take a tiny brush. I think you can see that okay. Tiny brush that's wet with clean water, and just agitate a little bit of paint off. It's interesting how well this Phthalo Green actually lifts, and the Prussian Blue. So what I'm doing is disrupting that area with some ripples in the water. No, a bit too wet. You have to make sure the brush isn't too wet. That was a little bit wet, but that's okay. And then I've just lifted off a few ripples there, which is quite a nice effect. Even here, if I wanted some lighter ripples. And you know what I could even try? I did lose between here and there. I lost a bit of light, and I'm going to try and get it back by making it into like mist in the background here, as I'm having such success lifting these colours. Just taking that back, making it look a little bit misty back there. And I might make the edge of this sky a little softer. It was a bit of a hard edge there, so I'm softening it up with that little brush. Just, yeah, I mean, that's kind of useful. I would never have thought that the Prussian Blue and the Phthalo Green would have lifted so well. They are usually a heavy stain. I'm going to take a little bit of that out too, just give a bit more light space between those trees. Now I'm going to just pull back a little bit, because you're looking at it really closely, and sometimes it doesn't bear such close scrutiny when you need to see it from a distance to get a really good idea of how it's looking. I'm going to explain some of the finishing touches. And I'm wondering how far along you are, if any of you are sort of like struggling to keep up there. I know that doing the dark paint can be quite a lot of painstaking work. It's not always easy, and you really have to think about what you're doing when you're doing it. Under the camera, mine looks kind of patchy, But in real life it doesn't look quite as patchy as it does under the camera. So there's a couple of things that we can put in if you want, you don't have to. In the photo there were these shafts of light from the aurora, and there's a few stars in the night sky. So I made the shafts of light with a pastel and an eyeshadow applicator, and I made the stars with my good old friend Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. Now it needs to be really, really dry to do that, so mine is really dry. Made sure I dried it, and I need extremely clean water for the white, so I'm just going to go grab some really clean water. I've done that. So the first thing I want to do is the pastel. So we're gonna do these shafts of light in the sky. I need the photo because I want to make sure that I don't want to overdo this. Overdoing it's going to make it look really unpleasant. So there's a little shaft of light here. Now, so I'm going to put a little tiny bit of pastel on there, and then I want to smudge it. Now this applicator's got pink on it. I don't want one with pink on. Probably all of mine are contaminated now. Let's see what this one's got on it. Well, that was not a good start. Let's try again. A little bit of white. You know what I meant to pick up at Dollarama was some clean, beautifully clean eyeshadow applicators. It's a bit late to think about that now. So I'm just easing that little bit of white in with a sponge. You could use a Q-tip probably. I have some clean Q-tips. Let's give that a go. They just need to be smudged a little bit so that they are soft. And then there's sort of a little bit more coming down here. These shafts of light get a bit wider as they go up into the sky, so just widening the tops and then pulling upwards. There's quite a white one here. Now, if you don't want to risk ruining a good sky that you've done, don't do this. You know, you might hate it and then think, oh, I did that beautiful sky and now I've ruined it with this pastel. And these are chalk pastels, not an oil pastel. They're a chalk pastel. And ordinary chalk probably wouldn't grab your paper very well. These are very, very faint over here. Because it's the end of the painting, I'm not worried about putting more paint on. I'm going to just smudge the tops. I also have pastel pencils, but I think they would be too harsh for this. I think I tried them. Yeah, they're a bit too harsh. I think that just the ordinary soft chalk pastel works best. You can buy them individually, I think, at Iron Oxide. I have a whole set of them. And you don't have to do this part. Just a suggestion. And last thing, let's get some white to protect the painting. Get my white and very, very clean water. My pH, I've got a little pot for it. And my pH Martin Spite, I've got a little bit in there and a bit of water, and then I'm just adding a bit more to get a nice creamy mix. I just leave it in this pot, and then when I need it again, I can just bung some water in there and get it working again. I have another pot there too, but this pot's probably a little bit more practical. Right, let's have a practice first. I don't like to do stuff without practicing. Grab a piece of paper, again, protect my work. And just let's give it a tap. Yeah, that's looking okay, I think. The right consistency. Now when I'm tapping, I always have my brush at a 45-degree angle, and I like, some people, oh, that's a little watery now. Some people like to flick. I prefer to tap. Just adding a little bit more white because that was a little bit watery. I probably added too much. There we go. A few little stars in the night sky. Just to finish it off. I don't put any down here, just in the sky. My brush a good clean. And I'm going to call that one done. Well, I think that was quite a tough painting, the Aurora. I do struggle with that quite often when I try to paint it, but I hope yours went well. I hope you had fun, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now.